Dan, tell us what it was like for you and for the people of Tel Aviv, and whether this indeed was something different tonight.
It was different. It was a major upping of the ante versus what we saw in April, because in April, Iran telegraphed that they would do this, and they fired mostly very slow-moving drones, and it was a little bit comical. This was almost 200 ballistic missiles flying at 15,000 miles an hour, which means it gets here from Iran in about 15 minutes. There was a great degree of tension, that's for sure. I was actually in the studio at I-24, a local multi-language, including English language, all-news station, and we had to decide whether to stay on the air. And for a while we did, until the control room emptied, everything emptied. Wow. It was just us on the air, and we basically, we started getting like Israeli central home front command messages on a cell phone saying get thee to a sheltered area, and so we sort of shut down the broadcast for about 15 minutes, then went back on. But that was on the edge, for sure.
Were there explosions near that area? I know, the northern in that area near the studio, you could hear them.
Absolutely, we heard sirens wailing like I've never heard a siren wail, and then I must have heard about 10 explosions. I think most of them were interceptions. You have to see what happened here. This is more complex than appears. Just as Iran telegraphed their previous attack, they also telegraphed this attack. They told the Americans and they told the Russians, so they knew the Israelis would. It kind of looks like they didn't want to succeed too much while looking like they did a whole lot. And the fact is, Iran fired almost 200 ballistic missiles at Israel, which sounds enormous, and yet 0 people were hurt. No one, as far as we know, was hurt. So this is a weird situation where it's not clear that Israel can possibly let this go. It's not clear the world should let this go. But it's also clear that Iran, which is perhaps the gold medalist on the planet at playing games, is playing games. And there's a real strategic decision what to do right now.
Yeah, let's see.
Because
go ahead. No, finish that thought then.
I'll tell you where Iran is not playing games is that Iran really is spreading chaos around the region with proxy groups in Yemen and Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq as well, and really creating a noose around Israel as the first line of defense for the West. And there is a question about whether the West right now wants to draw the line and read the riot act to Tehran. If they don't, then Israel will have to decide what to do. And it's not irrelevant that no one was hurt in Israel, but it's also not irrelevant that this is incredibly brazen and people could have been hurt by the hundreds. So big decision coming up in Israel, and I think there will be some expectation that the West back him up.
Dan Perry pointed out there's some big decisions to be made.
Look, Dan Perry is one of the best journalists vis-a-vis the Middle East in the world, was a longtime AP bureau chief for the Middle East, ran operations when I was there as a correspondent. I'll leave that assessment to him. From the U.S. perspective, a few things stood out to me. You picked up on significant consequences. That was the same line that was used by the United States before the attack. They said if Iran attacks, there will be significant consequences. The issue is that has to mean something, right? Sort of like Obama's red line, that if you don't speak the language your enemies speak and understand, it doesn't really mean anything. The other question, coordinated with the Israelis in terms of a response. So far, the Israelis have not had much interest in coordinating with the United States, right? The Hassan Nasrallah strike, the United States wasn't read in on before it happened. The pager explosion operation, the U.S. not read in on. A lot of the other Israeli operations, the U.S. not read in on. It is difficult to underscore just how little trust there is in Jerusalem and in the Kiryat, which is in Tel Aviv, the Israeli Pentagon, if you will, of the United States and of this administration.
From Israel's point of view, Dan, as you were talking about a few minutes ago, how do you balance the fact that apparently nobody was killed in these particular attacks with the idea that these were, I guess by any account, probably the most aggressive attack we've seen by Iran directly into Israel, right? I know it's the second time this year, but this time, they really meant it. And how does that work into the response? The fact that maybe even though they did, they weren't that successful.
Well, and furthermore, it looks like they didn't want to be that successful by having given such warning. So this is Iran, as I said before, playing games. From Israel's perspective, it's not just about this attack. I think in Israel, the patience has completely run out with the
Right.
so-called Iranian ring of fire that involves the Houthis and Hezbollah, not just causing Israel damage, but causing Egypt enormous damage in the Suez Canal and hijacking the state of Lebanon and destroying the Western effort to create a democracy in Iraq. The entire edifice of spectacular skullduggery that Iran has built around the region because of its stupendous ambitions to project a global power type of jihadi expansion around the world. Israel's had enough of it. That's clear. And whereas Israel is normally very much divided on what to do with the Palestinians, and Netanyahu specifically is a rather toxic and extremely unpopular leader in Israel. He has a strong base that's very much behind him, but like 60% would like him gone. All this is tremendous complexity, but what is simple is that there is consensus in Israel that this Iranian thing has gone way too far. Now, they have nothing against the Iranians, but the Islamic Republic of Iran, from the Israeli perspective, is at this point so much of a menace that a Rubicon has been crossed, regardless of what I'm conceding is probably their desire to not have actually caused so much damage today. So this is way complex. And right now, there are basically three levels that this response can take. And everyone knows that there's going to be a response, Matthew Miller said so himself, but
Yep.
it can be very, very pro forma, like strike at some infrastructure thing to say, all right, you hit at us and killed no one. We strike at you and kill no one. It can be tactical, like definitely a warning, don't do this again. For example, hitting at oil installations or more, some major infrastructure thing to make them think 2, 3, and 20 times about ever doing this again. Or, and I think this is what Israel really wants, or some manner of a strategic shift on the whole issue of Iran. And I've written about this before, where the world decides that, like Israel has figured out enough is enough, this can't go on. And they read the riot act of the regime in Iran and tell them, look, we're not going to do regime change necessarily tomorrow, but you got to change things.
Dan went through many of the options that Israel has, and how aggressive Israel will be is still an open question. As he says, there seems to be consensus in Israel that, you know, we're sick and tired of this. We got to do something. What about the U.S. role in this? Do you think there really is any role that the Biden administration will play at this point, given the tensions you and I were just speaking about?
Well, in the past, it would be unquestionable support, both tactically, diplomatically, on every single front. And I was nodding throughout Dan's comments. I completely agree. What I'm watching really closely for, and I think it is worth pointing out, no matter which of those three routes Israel takes, or whether they do nothing, which I think is a very low probability
Right.
in this case, they will be critiqued, and some, including on the very progressive left wing of the Democratic Party, will say Israel provoked this somehow. They provoked Iran. This is what's happening. Look at the history of the region. And so I do think in these conversations about what Israel does, we should also look down the road a couple weeks from now, a month from now. There will absolutely, no matter what Israel does, be blame put on Israel by some people from all across the political spectrum.
Your thoughts on that, Dan? To me, that probably, if that's true, there's probably a political problem potentially for Kamala Harris running for president here in the U.S. But what about on the Israeli side?
There's no question. I think the actual target date is not October 7th, but November 6th, the day after the U.S. election. The U.S. cannot do anything resembling a paradigm shift without great fear on the part of the administration of losing Michigan because of the Muslim vote in that state. The U.S. until then is going to continue this rather lame and, from the Israeli perspective, pathetic reflexive mantra of no escalation. Now, can you imagine? Can you imagine the world telling Winston Churchill in 1941, please don't escalate? That is what the Israelis feel like. Now, if you're asking me, do I agree with that? As a journalistic observer, yeah, I kind of do. I mean, this idea that Israel can possibly continue to absorb an Iranian proxy mafia militia parked on its border, digging tunnels, preparing to do an October 7th from the north, and not do anything about it, lest the world think it's escalating, is a little bit preposterous. It truly, genuinely is, and we need to remember one basic thing that maybe viewers don't remember. Hezbollah began attacking Israel on October 8th. That was the day after the October 7th invasion by Hamas that barbarously massacred 1,200 people, and before the Israeli reaction. In other words, the Israeli reaction, which some might say is an overreaction, and I myself think that was a very brutal war that Israel conducted in Gaza, still not fully successful, but also not a failure. That is what it is. Hezbollah wasn't reacting to that. Hezbollah was trying to pile on because
Right.
of the jihadist narrative and the Iranian imperative of trying to injure Israel. Now, when we try to injure an organism, what is it going to do? Is it gonna listen forever to pleas to not escalate? I think Israel at this point, no matter what you think of Netanyahu, and as I said, he has his odious side, but in this case, just like a broken clock is right twice a day, Netanyahu is right about the axis of resistance and the role of Iran, and we're seeing a crossing of the Rubicon here.
All right, Dan, thank you for everything. Lauren Wright as well.